I entered the world as Mary Lorraine Stober in 1919, and I held that name for 23 years. My father, Ernest Stober, had a big dairy farm, owned about 68 acres, and rented another 40 across the railroad tracks in Middleton. Nearby, my uncle maintained a big apple orchard. The farm landscape rolled with beauty and diversity everywhere. Everywhere. Now you have to look across the rural scene to find interesting places. We had bobwhite quail, western and eastern meadowlarks, red-headed woodpeckers, and eastern bluebirds. At that time, meadowlarks were common. We had barbed wire fences, old fence posts, and the fence posts had either bluebirds or red-headed woodpeckers working them. Hickory nut trees occurred on the farm border. Wonderful oak trees grew around our house, and prairie plants hugged the railroad tracks. We burned areas by the railroad tracks and roadsides every year. I can remember the old wooden fence posts catching on fire because grass had grown and matted around them. In the middle of the night, I remember Father saying he saw a glowing fence post. He tried to put the fire out to save the fence post. I loved every minute that I was on the farm. Every day was different, whether we were planting potatoes. My father put a spade in the ground, opening it up a little as I dropped the potato roots in. Then he stepped gently on the soil, putting in the plant, or picking rhubarb or asparagus to sell them to stores in town, working the hay loader or taking strawberries out of a can of water. I remember sitting on a load of hay and driving a team of horses down the row while wearing a big straw hat with daddy longlegs crawling around the hat's edge. I reached the end of the row and I didn't know how to turn. So my father yelled out, "It's just like your kitty card." But I couldn't transfer it in my mind, and he had to jump on at the last moment to prevent a calamity. I think the greatest effect of all from how we have cared for lawns is the loss of food for migrating and resident birds. For centuries, birds have been flying north and south, with immature birds flying south for the first time. Imagine them mowing over the countryside, where once abundant wildflowers grew. You would see that they had this big cupboard with all these shrubs that had fruit, seeds, and berries for them. A smorgasbord of wonderful things, from Solomon seals and false Solomon seals, baneberries, blue cohosh, and jack-in-the-pulpits. What a feast! Now they've got a bare cupboard. People say that these lawn care people have learned that if you cut off the tips of shrubs, it will make them branch or make them fuller. But they also aren't told that those are the growing tips. That's where the flowers are. That's where the berries are. This, of course, impacts the birds. We should have commitment, obligation to take care of those birds. I mean, almost everybody loves songbirds, and yet many people don't see the whole picture. The bird just doesn't eat seeds. When they have their young, it's soft, tiny insects that they're feeding those featherless babies in their nests. So let's preserve and maintain breeding habitats. Such thinking needs to enter more minds of the bird businessman. The guy who sells bird seed should say, "How many shrubs do you have around? Do you have wildflowers underneath those shrubs? Do you have some nice native trees?" I don't think he usually does that. Speaking of birds, I used to keep track of bird occurrences on calendars and sometimes in the margins of bird identification books, but mostly on calendars. Then I'd write down the day the fox sparrows arrived or the first white-throated sparrows. I did that for years when I belonged to the Phenological Society. When I moved here to the Milwaukee area, it was the 1st of September, and warblers hit the windows in a large number. I can remember saying to my husband, "I have to move into a motel. I can't stand this." I stapled garden fencing around the windows to remedy the situation when mobiles failed. Now there are so darn few warblers. Who's going to hit a window? I've lived here almost 50 years and witnessed a dramatic change, a precipitous drop in the number of birds. At first, a big drop occurred during the DDT spraying, followed by a gradual buildup, and now so few numbers. In the springtime back then, you'd be awakened in the morning by all the fox sparrows rustling and scratching in the leaves. You'd look down the side of the ravines and see that the color of the leaves and soil and the color of their backs appeared all the same because they occurred in such high number. Now what? I'm up to 4 fox sparrows. Another thing, we don't know how many birds are killed by cats. Cats are not a normal thing in our environment. There's a woman who lives on the other side of Round Lake Drive who has a little daughter that became very precious to me because she's a wonderful little artist. I made a videotape with her drawing seed pods from my prairie for a project for a school, so I already knew her and her mother well. One day, I looked out the window and I saw their cat in my yard. She had this teeny-weeny little brown thing I assumed was a meadow vole. So I went out to get it because I wanted to photograph it for another series of slides I was doing. By golly, it was a little winter wren, dead by the time I retrieved her. So I went over to her house, rang the doorbell, and the mother and the daughter came to the door. I said, "Some people think this is the most beautiful song that we ever hear around here. This tiny little wren is here for just a short time, and it doesn't come in flocks. Just once in a great while you hear this lovely, lovely call, and it will never call again. I don't know if there are any more winter wrens, and I don't know when the next one will ever appear, but your cat ended its life." Then this woman just stood there, wide-eyed. I handed the wren to the girl and said, "You may want to make a sketch of this because it's so nice and fresh. When you get a chance to have a winter wren in the palm of your hand, how often does that happen?" The mother said, "Oh well, to please you, we'll try to keep the cat indoors." To please me, nothing. I may have only a few months on this earth. You are the mother of a child. There are 2 generations here. You have so much longer to live, and your child even longer than you, if everything goes normally. Do you really want to grow up where there are fewer and fewer birds? Or maybe just 1 or 2 kinds of birds? Is that the kind of world you want? That's your responsibility, not mine. You keep that cat in your house because you feel and know that that's where it ought to be. Lori was also very instrumental in helping to mobilize individuals to work toward the ban of DDT in Wisconsin. I asked her about her life in a more intimate way. This is what she had to offer me at the end of our conversation together. "If I have any regrets about this life, they would involve mistakes I made with my son George. Years ago, there were 2 mistakes that I made. One, that I didn't run to Canada with him during the Vietnam War. Instead, he came right out of high school and went directly into the Army. He was such a gentle boy. I think maybe in the back of Owen, that's her husband, Owen's head, going into the Army would turn George into a man. He'd see the other side of life. I don't know. Anyway, we let him go. I didn't fight it. He became an Army medic. But tragically, everyone else in his class was killed in Vietnam. George was the only one who survived because they sent him to Korea instead. He had received basic training in Texas. Once, close to Christmas, he decorated the entire compound, and no boy had ever done this. I received a letter from his commanding officer. At first, I was afraid to open it. I couldn't imagine. I thought maybe he had been shot by mistake. I opened it, and this commander wrote this glowing letter about what this boy had done. When it came time to place these young men, everybody went to Vietnam except George. They sent him to the DMZ, the demilitarized zone in Korea, as an ambulance driver. So that's where he spent his time. When he returned, he came home with such a hatred for the government that he didn't vote for years. He wouldn't get married. He wasn't going to sign a contract ever again. And so for 12 years, he lived with this wonderful girl until they finally broke up. George was so bitter that had his father not been a psychiatrist, I'm sure we would have had to commit him somewhere. At the time, Owen served as head of the psychiatric hospital in Oconomowoc, and I was working on the grounds there. Well, after George returned from Korea, the Army sent him to Fort Lewis near Tacoma, Washington, to finish off his term. It must have been awful, just awful. At one time, Owen and I had a wonderful relationship with both of my children. We talked about everything, of his experience at Fort Lewis. George would only say, "I can't tell you what happens when a bunch of men live together." When George returned, he came to work out at the hospital grounds because I was landscaping there, and I needed him. I needed his sense of design. He was a very talented artist, and of course he was big and strong and a wonderful guy to work with. But George's art changed dramatically when he returned from overseas. It was hideous. Dying people and swords going into chests, people standing in an ocean of blood. He decorated his room with his dreadful posters that he brought back from Seattle. So you could see where his mind had gone. In the afternoon, when I would go into his room to take a nap, those drawings looked so terrible that when I closed my eyes, they hurt me. Finally, I said to him, "I cannot stand being in your room. These are awful." So bit by bit, we would remove them. For the next 24 years, except during vacations, George would walk with his dad in the afternoon around one of the lakes in Waukesha. They became very close, and then his father developed lung and brain cancer, and George sat with him while he died. A year went by, and I said to him, "Does it get any better?" "No," he said. "It's worse. I feel as if God has died." Shortly before Owen died, George finally got married. After Owen's death, they went off to Leadville, Colorado to open a hardware store. His wife's son, just out of the Air Force, also helped out. I think they made $1 million the first year, but the store had been robbed twice, so they had resale guns on hand. One day the stepson wanted to borrow a gun, and George gave him his handgun. At a party, that man, in front of his brother, and whoever else was at the party, excused himself to go into his room to get some cigarettes. He came back with the gun, and then to everybody's horror, blew his brains out in front of everybody with George's gun. So George felt responsible. He stopped eating, and in 3 weeks, on September 22nd, 1997, he was dead. They found his body on the bathroom floor. He was so healthy. He didn't wear glasses. He didn't have any cavities in his mouth. He was this big, strong, gorgeous creature, and only 47. I've heard it all my life when you get bad news. Well, I was sitting down, but I can understand why they say that, because you're involuntary. And your smooth muscles start to quiver like jelly. I just shivered and didn't know what to think. Where was George? All I could think was, well, he's wherever he was before he grew inside of me. So he's nothing. He's now nothingness, and it's forever. When I started to think about it, I was determined that it was not going to impair my life, because I had too few years left. I could not take a year off to grieve, And after all, this occurred in Leadville, Colorado, at such an altitude that I couldn't go to visit him anyway. So I didn't. I took his photographs off the refrigerator. I was all packed to go west anyway. I couldn't get there fast enough. And the other thing was, I had no relationship with his wife. I hardly knew her at all. So neither Patricia, her daughter, her other child, so neither Patricia nor I went to the funeral. As I prepared to leave the house to go to the airport, I remembered letters that he had written to me. I had 10 years of letters. I opened up the drawer and threw them all in a shopping bag and got on the airplane. So on the day of his funeral, Tricia and I read aloud his letters. By the time we went to bed, we felt we'd been with him, really been with him. The next day, one of Tricia's friends had a computer we used to create 2 pages of paragraphs from his different letters. We ran a couple of 100 copies off and sent these to people to let them know that George had died. I wanted to say to everybody, well, if you have children, make them write letters to you. That's all I had left of him. I thought about all of the mothers who lost their sons, who were George's contemporaries. Kids that had just left high school. They lost their sons before they knew what kind of men they would grow into. But I knew. I had to read that because it gives you a sense of what some of the naturalists spoke to me about. It wasn't all about birds and plants and animals. Some of them shared some very personal stories. And I wasn't sure if their relatives would want them, but in this case, Patricia said, yes, you must print this.
From your